Alright, so for day 2, we have Requiem from the Darkness, which is a 13 episode series that was based after a short story collection called The Wicked and the Damned: 100 Tales of Karma. And obviously, other than horror, this one is also considered as a crime and mystery. Now, when it comes to the books, I have heard a little bit about them before, but when I heard about this anime, I actually didn't know that they were connected at all until much later. So anyways, let's talk about the story. So it begins in the Edo period of Japan, where it follows the main character, Momosuke. And he is a writer of children's tales, but he got bored of that and decided to move on to much more darker things, such as making a book called The Book of 100 Ghost Stories. So because of this, he wants to go on adventures by going to different haunted and cursed areas, so then he can write stories about his experiences. So on one rainy night, he ends up finding a old store that is abandoned, but it happens to be 3 people living in there. But the trio of them happens to be the Ongyu. So the 3 of them consist of Madaichi, who happens to be a spiritualist who is very short, and then you have Ogin, who is a puppeteer who is very voluptuous. And finally there's Nagamimi, who happens to be a shapeshifter who is really huge. So the Ongyu, the 3 characters that I just said, they're all considered as detectives, but they're not detectives in the traditional sense. Firstly, they all have supernatural powers, and secondly, whenever they catch someone, they happen to punish them with a horrible death because the people that they have to deal with are very terrible pieces of shit, and they mostly consist of murderers and rapists. So yes, they go around solving crimes, but instead of just arresting the fucker, they just kill his ass. And Momosuke has a really weird fascination with these 3, for that he thinks that whenever they get involved with something, he can actually write it down in his book. And of course the 3 of them keep telling him that it's not a good idea to follow us because you don't need to see any of this shit. But because of his naive nature, he just does it anyway. So yes, that sums up the basics of what you need to know about this one. But before we move on, one thing I should mention is that this anime has some fucking balls. So when I mean they really do try to punish those evil pieces of shit, I really mean that because even women and children in the show are not safe. Just as an example, and this is the very beginning of the very first episode, is that you see a kid getting his head smashed in by a rock. Yeah, it pretty much sets the tone for this one. So now, let's get moving on to the other things, like the animation. And the animation in this one is really fucking cool, because this one has a very unique look to it that I don't think I've ever seen in another anime before, at least not that I can think of. Plus, on top of this, the other thing that I really like is how everything looks so distorted and curvy. It's almost like you're in a nightmare. If that style reminds me of anything, it sort of reminds me of the old German silent film, The Cabinet of Caligari. You know how everything in there was all distorted and how the doorways were really bendy and shit? Yeah, that's what this art style sort of reminds me of, and it's really fucking awesome. I love it. And the character designs are really nice too. I don't really have any complaints about them. I think they all look really good and fit the show. And the overall animation flow is just really nicely done. But if there's one thing that might surprise you is that despite the fact that this show has a lot of shock value for things like, women and children get killed, well, knowing this show is surprisingly not as gory as you think it would be. Now, don't get me wrong, this show does have plenty of violence, you won't be disappointed, but what I'm saying is that it doesn't feel over the top or excessive. For such examples being Hellsing Ultimate, Violent Jack, or even Genocyber. But I think the fact that this show isn't as over the top violence though does fit with this show, considering that this show already has enough shock value as it is, so I think it works well. But yeah, overall, the animation in this one is overall really fantastic, and I really love it a lot. It's definitely one of my favorite parts about it. And now, as for the show's music, the music is really good for that it does fit the tone very well. You get a lot of atmospheric stuff, which you do expect for this kind of thing. And overall, just really blends in perfectly, but there's no real catchy tunes within this one, but that's fine, because I do expect this one to have more of an ambience feel to it, and it does that well. But as for the opening and ending themes, they are pretty good, but it was definitely not what I was expecting. Because they kinda sound very smooth jazz, and well, yeah, that's kinda random. But after watching through more of it, I kinda realized that it actually does fit with it quite well, and I did kinda like it. And now, as for the show's voice acting, the voice acting in here, if you're watching this one in English, is that it's actually really solid. So the main character, Momosuke, is being played by Grant George, and I think he does do a pretty good job here. Even though I prefer Grant George to be playing characters that are more like badass, and while Momosuke is definitely not that, but I think he does do a good job with the younger character roles too. And then Madiichi is played by Steve Kramer, and he nails this role really well. Definitely one of my favorites within the show. And then Orgine is being played by Karen Strassman, and that's definitely a great thing, for that she is one of my many favorites. And finally, Nagamimi is being played by Michael McConaughey, and that is pretty fucking awesome. So yes, all four of the main characters are definitely done really well, but as for everyone else, well, they're pretty decent for the most part. Nothing terrible, but definitely nothing as good as the main cast. But I do think it is at the very least important to get the main cast really well, considering those are the ones that are gonna appear in like every episode. So yes, watching this one in both English or in Japanese, no matter which one you pick, it's definitely gonna be really great. So now, as for my overall thoughts on Requiem from the Darkness, is that this one was really fucking good. Now I have to say, I went into this one not really knowing a whole lot about it. I just looked at the name and the picture and was like, oh, this looks cool, let's add it to the list. And other than that, I went into it pretty much blind, and well, I was pleasantly surprised to know that I actually really like this one a lot. So the concept itself is pretty cool, and the characters are really great, and they do get some really good development as the story goes on. But my favorite part about it would have to be the animation, for that it has a very unique look to it that was really fascinating. But yeah, other than all this, I really have a hard time trying to find any like major complaints with this show. I mean, if I had to complain about one thing, and this is a very minor thing mind you, so at the ending of one episode, I forget which episode it was, but anyways, so at the ending of it, there was a part where Momosuke like does something really stupid, and then he like says something like cheesy about it, and then like everyone in the room laughs about it, and that's like the end of the episode. You know, the whole typical like cheesy joke ending thing. So first of all, it was just really stupid and not funny, and secondly, it just really didn't fit the show whatsoever. It just felt like shoehorned in at last minute. But thankfully, it was only in one episode, so knowing that, I actually really like this one a hell lot. And it's only 13 episodes too, so it's really not a long one, and I think it does do a good job with making up its 13 episode mark. So if you do like some horror animes that take place in the olden days, this one is definitely a great one that I can highly recommend. And I'm kind of surprised I never even heard about this one whatsoever, so maybe it's one of those like underrated animes that not a lot of people talked about when it came out. So if you haven't seen it, I can recommend checking it out, except for if you're one of those sensitive types, then well, yeah, don't watch this one, it has a lot of fucked up shit.